Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This editorial deals with the impact of infrastructure development on the sensitive ecosystem of the Himalayas. We have been discussing over the last few classes that a set of new hydropower projects have been planned in the state of Uttarakhand to exploit the hydropower potential of the Himalayan rivers. The presence of perennial rivers, which are fed by glaciers, and the unique topography of the Himalayan mountains creates great hydropower potential, which can help fulfill the power needs of the region. And also, since hydropower is clean and renewable, constructing these hydropower projects is seen as an attractive option to address the energy needs of the Himalayan states. But however, the ecology of Himalayas is very sensitive and vulnerable, and since the region is prone to a variety of natural hazards, such large scale infrastructure projects can have a detrimental impact, thereby creating several environmental and ecological challenges. The immature and unstable nature of the Himalayan mountains have made the region prone to several natural hazards, including earthquakes, landslips or landslides, avalanches, floods, and cloudburst events. In the last few years itself, we have seen many such disasters, which has caused enormous damage to life and property in the region. But despite these grave environmental and ecological challenges, infrastructure development in the region has continued unabated, and especially in the tourism and construction sector, large scale projects and unplanned development has led to extensive deforestation, which in turn aggravates the impact of these disasters. Upon this, as climate change and global warming continues to accelerate extreme weather events, the Himalayan belt in particular would become all the more vulnerable, and hence one has to be extremely cautious while planning and taking up these large scale infrastructure development projects, considering the sensitive environment and ecology of the Himalayas. Recently, multiple hydropower projects have been proposed, which have been backed by the Uttarakhand government in order to meet the power needs of the state. But however, environmental activists and several experts are pointing out the ecological threat posed by some of these projects, which could directly contribute to aggravating disasters in the region. In fact, even the Supreme Court has taken note of these developments, and especially after the devastating floods witnessed at Kedarnath in 2013, the Supreme Court had even ordered a halt to all these hydropower projects and had called for a complete review of these projects by a team of experts in order to consider the environmental impact of these projects. So, based on this review, different stakeholders have taken different positions based on their respective interests. For example, the hydropower projects that have been planned are seen as a threat to the objectives of the National Mission for Clean Ganga. This top priority project of the central government aims to maintain clean waters in the middle and lower reaches of the Ganga and its tributaries. And for that purpose, there has to be a continuous flow of the water, because as the flow of the water is affected or obstructed, it will have a direct ecological impact in the downstream areas. But these hydropower projects are seen as an obstacle which affects the flow of the water and thereby the quality of the water available in the downstream areas. So, based on this assessment, the committee of experts, which were guided by the Supreme Court, they have highlighted the environmental impact of these projects, and they have even recommended that these projects need to be scrapped. Even the Water Resources Ministry, which implements the National Mission for Clean Ganga, has taken a stand against these hydropower projects. But the other stakeholders, especially the power companies, the state government, and the Ministry of Power, they happen to support these projects in the interest of infrastructure development, and also by keeping in mind the economic interests of the stakeholders who would have already invested considerable amounts into these projects. So, this has led to a divide within the ministries and as well as amongst experts, where a few stakeholders are proponents of these projects, whereas other stakeholders are opposing these projects. So the center, which has been caught between these stakeholders, has tried to strike a balance by openly acknowledging the environmental concerns in the parliament, but however, it continues to back and support the ongoing projects, especially in order to meet the energy needs of the region and as well as to protect the economic interests of the investors and the stakeholders. The center is willing to permit those projects, especially those which have reached at least 50% of completion. Whereas on the new projects, even the center seems to be taking a back seat, considering the widespread environmental concerns around large scale hydropower projects. So, this leads us to the debate between infrastructure development and eco conservation, especially in environmentally sensitive areas. So, in this regard, the editorial is of the opinion that infrastructure development and eco conservation they should go hand in hand, and the center has to ensure a better dialogue between all the stakeholders to ensure that infrastructure development is not derailed, and at the same time, the environmental concerns are given the highest priority. So, what is clear is that infrastructure development in such sensitive areas will have to take into account the constraints of the region. And if any of these projects pose a considerable threat, then such projects will either have to be dropped or they will have to be redesigned by keeping in mind the environmental concerns. But at any cost, infrastructure projects which do not take into account the environmental considerations should not be allowed to go ahead as they could have a serious impact on a disaster prone region. Now let's look at another editorial from page number 6, which deals with the topic of rape, women's security, and the continuing insensitivity of the state and our society towards rape victims. See, even after stringent laws and a legal framework has been put in place, especially after the Nirbhaya gang rape incident of 2012, horrific cases of rape continue to be reported from across the country almost on a daily basis. In fact, latest data from the National Crime Records Bureau indicates that in India, a rape occurs every 16 minutes, and this alarming statistic highlights the need for women's security and women empowerment. But despite all the laws and the legal framework, these incidents continue to happen. And unfortunately, every time an incident happens, our politicians who are part of the government and conservative elements in the society, they continue to make highly insensitive statements where they blame the victim in order to absolve themselves of their responsibilities and to promote the conservative patriarchal mindset of the society. This editorial has been brought out in the context of horrific rapes that have been reported across the country, including the recent incident in Mysuru, in Delhi, and as well as the rape of two minor girls in Goa. Following these incidents, several insensitive statements have again been made by senior politicians and even by conservative elements in the society who try to pin the blame for these incidents on the victim itself. They often question the kind of clothes the victim was wearing during the incident or why the victim went out to an isolated place during the after dark hours. They even bring the victim's past into question and make insensitive statements about their character, their upbringing, and their moral values. Let's say if the victim was wearing short clothes, or if she had a boyfriend, or if she was known to consume alcohol or attend parties, or if she was visiting isolated places late in the night, then these conservative elements in the society, along with politicians and senior leaders, often raise questions over the character of the victim and her moral values, and they attempt to pin the whole blame on the victim herself. The editorial strongly criticizes this insensitivity of politicians and conservative elements and points out that this victim blaming is a clear reflection of the patriarchal orthodox mindset of the Indian society. The editorial correctly points out that women's security cannot be ensured by restricting or curbing their rights and freedom, or by treating them as below par based on their gender. Politicians and government leaders often resort to this insensitivity in order to avoid blame and responsibility for these incidents, and it's a solution for them to cover their failures with regard to upholding women's security. For conservative elements, this is an opportunity to push forward their patriarchal orthodox mindset, and through such insensitive statements, they seek to restrict the rights and freedom of women and to control the behavior of women by judging their character. The editorial points out that unfortunately, even the judiciary has been lacking in this regard because repeatedly the judiciary has failed to recognize marital rape as an offense. And even recently, the Kerala High Court and the Chhattisgarh High Court refused to acknowledge that even forced sex in a marriage is not an offense, not a rape, thereby shaking the conscience of the country. The editorial points out while the high courts are correct legally in not recognizing marital rape as an offense, but by failing to acknowledge this legal gap, they are further perpetuating the patriarchal orthodox mindset in the society. In fact, this has even been acknowledged by the Supreme Court in the landmark Aparna Bhatt vs. State of Madhya Pradesh case, where the Supreme Court acknowledged that the patriarchy and misogyny in the society gets reflected in judicial orders as well, and it had called for an end for such judicial rulings. But despite this, the insensitivity of the government, the society, and the judiciary towards rape victims continues. And hence, the editorial concludes by stating that women's safety and security and the objective of preventing rape should not be driven by the patriarchal need to restrict and control the rights and freedom of women. Instead, the society and the state should come together to empower women and promote gender equality and gender empowerment. And through strict laws and efficient policing, we need to tackle the offense of rape, followed by societal reforms. Now, let's take up a column from page number 6 that deals with the topic of indemnity waiver that has been sought by COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers. See, the Drugs Controller General of India has granted emergency use authorization to several COVID-19 vaccines. Currently, the most common vaccines being used are Covishield, Covaxin, and Sputnik. Apart from these three vaccines, the DCGI has approved a few other vaccines as well, including the vaccines manufactured by Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer BioNTech. But even after getting the emergency use authorization, these vaccines are still not widely available in India, and we are still facing a massive supply shortage, which has ended up slowing down India's vaccination program. Despite the best efforts of the government, and despite record number of vaccinations being done every day, only 11% of the total population has been fully vaccinated, and just around 35.5% have received a single dose. The writers point out that the reason why India's vaccination program is falling behind is mainly because there is a severe shortage of supply in the markets. The manufacturers of Covishield, Covaxin, and Sputnik alone are not able to meet the demand, and hence, if India has to accelerate the vaccination drive, it desperately needs the other vaccines to enter the market. But these foreign companies are not bringing their vaccines to India despite getting the emergency use authorization because they want a waiver on legal indemnity. This demand of vaccine manufacturers basically translates to legal protection from any proceedings and liabilities against them in case of side effects and adverse events. See, prior to granting any approval, vaccines are thoroughly tested and reviewed for their safety and efficacy. But despite this, vaccines might leave behind a few serious and severe side effects, especially amongst a small group of individuals. And these rare and serious side effects are technically known as adverse events following immunization or AEFI. In case of such rare events, the vaccine manufacturer always has a concern that the victims might sue them and file a case against them, demanding compensation, as they are legally held liable to compensate the victims of such rare adverse events. But in the case of the pandemic, the vaccines have been developed and tested at very short notice. And while their basic safety and efficacy is guaranteed, there still might be chances of these rare events happening. And for these rare events, if the manufacturer is held liable and if they are brought under legal indemnity, then it becomes a deterrent for these vaccine manufacturers from bringing their vaccines to India, as they fear several legal lawsuits to be filed against them seeking compensation. Hence, considering the emergency circumstances, These vaccine manufacturers have been demanding a waiver from this indemnity clause, but the government of India has been holding back on this decision. And according to the writers, this indecisiveness on the part of the Indian government is affecting vaccine supplies, and they argue as to why this is an opportunity to provide for a long term solution with regard to legal indemnity. According to the writers, there are two primary reasons which are responsible for the government to hold back on its decision to grant this waiver. The first reason is that if the companies are granted a waiver from this indemnity, then someone else has to take up this responsibility of compensating the victims. And that, of course, would be the government. Then the government would have to take up the responsibility and provide adequate compensation to those who are affected by these rare adverse events. So this could end up becoming a financial burden for the government itself. So that's one of the reasons which is holding the government back. The other reason is that if a waiver is granted to these COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers, then it might set a wrong precedent and it might lead other vaccine producers as well to make similar demands in the future. While these concerns of the government are valid, the writers say that this should be no cause for its indecisiveness. Because considering the extent of the crisis created by the pandemic, it's of utmost importance and urgency to vaccinate a large and significant percentage of the population, and for this, we urgently require vaccine supplies. So the writers say that instead of the government holding back on this decision, it should treat this as an opportunity to institutionalize accountability by providing for adequate legal safeguards, which will not only grant indemnity waiver for vaccine manufacturers and protect them against legal proceedings, but at the same time, it should provide for adequate protection to the victims of such rare adverse events as well. So for this, India need to look at the other countries, especially the developed countries, as to what they have done. Countries like US, UK and others, they have granted the indemnity waiver, but at the same time, they have put in place other mechanisms to compensate such victims. Many of these countries have launched their own compensation program, and hence India can learn from the examples of the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, the European Union, and even from Singapore. Then also one needs to remember that this indemnity waiver is not a blanket immunity for the vaccine manufacturer. This waiver would apply only with regard to the emergency use authorization to deal with the pandemic. But in case of deliberate negligence and in case of deliberate acts of fraud, these producers and manufacturers can still be held accountable under the law. There are many other legal provisions available for that. And for example, the DCGI can take action against these companies under the provisions of the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940. Then the individuals who have been affected, they can still seek compensation even after an indemnity waiver has been granted, and they can directly file their petitions at consumer courts and high courts. Then even the Consumer Protection Act of 1986 has been recently amended, which allows the regulatory bodies to file legal cases on behalf of the individuals who have been affected. So such existing legal mechanisms will still provide for accountability of the manufacturers, and the government will have to consider a more comprehensive legal safeguard mechanism to protect the people and to protect public health while fast-tracking the availability of vaccines in the market. It can even consider establishing a compensation fund through which the victims of such rare events can be compensated, while the companies are granted only basic immunity, and by ensuring that there is no blanket immunity granted to these manufacturers. But for this to happen, the government will have to be more proactive and grab this opportunity to provide for institutionalization of accountability of vaccine manufacturers and put in place adequate legal safeguards by drawing lessons from other countries in order to protect public health. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that deals with the topic of police reforms and custodial torture and custodial violence. This column has been brought out because recently the Chief Justice of India raised concerns over custodial deaths and expressed alarm at the human rights situation in our police stations. So the writer of this column, who happens to be a senior IPS officer with the Chhattisgarh Police, evaluates the extent of human rights violations that take place in police stations by relying upon NCRB data and also evaluates India's progress towards reforming its police forces. See, data from the National Crime Records Bureau shows that, on an average, between 2010 and 2019, every year, around 100 custodial deaths were being reported in the country. Out of them, 3.5 persons were alleged to have died due to injuries caused by policemen, which is a clear result of custodial torture. The rest of the deaths have been reported due to injuries incurred while escaping custody, due to suicide, and other miscellaneous reasons such as illness and road accidents. But however, this number in itself is alarming and it highlights the need to carefully investigate any case of suspicious custodial death. Because in a modern civilized society ruled by a constitutional democracy, even a single case of custodial death and torture cannot be tolerated, and hence the writer examines the way forward to reduce incidents of police torture and custodial violence. He says that the starting point to reduce custodial violence and torture would be to first reduce the number of arrests that the police are carrying out, especially the unnecessary arrests. Because see, the law clearly states that for offences that involve imprisonment of less than 7 years, there is no need to arrest the accused immediately, and the police officer who is investigating the case, he or she should be satisfied that such an arrest is absolutely essential to prevent the accused from tampering with the evidence. Otherwise, there is no need for the police to arrest the accused. So when arrests are carried out only when required as per the law, it will definitely help in bringing down cases of police torture and custodial violence. Then in the context of police reforms, we have several recommendations that are readily available which have been brought out by various committees. For example, we have the Dharamveer Commission or the National Police Commission, which brought out several reports between 1977 and 81 calling for police reforms. Then we have the 154th Law Commission report of 1996. Then we have the Malimat Committee report of 2003 that dealt with reforming our criminal laws. Then we have the landmark ruling of the Supreme Court in the Prakash Singh case of 2006, through which the Supreme Court laid down 7 important directives for initiating police reforms in the country. All these reports and recommendations, they make it very clear that starting right at the level of the local police station, the function of investigation and law and order should be segregated and separated. Because police investigation is a specialized function, and by merging investigation and law and order, we have only burdened our police officers, who are eventually pushed to extract evidence, which in many cases pushes them to resort to violence and torture in order to gain confessions from the accused. So starting right from the level of local police station, going all the way up to our national agencies like the CBI and the NIA, this recommendation has to be strictly implemented as soon as possible so that investigation as a specialized professional function is separated from law and order. But this would require enormous resources, and this is where the current challenge lies. Even as our population and the volume of crimes have gone up significantly, and even as different types of crimes have evolved with technology, we do not have sufficient number of police officers available, and this poor police to population ratio has overburdened the police officers, leaving them with scant resources, which prevents the segregation of investigation from law and order. A few states and few national agencies have made some progress in this regard, but to achieve this segregation across all levels, we need more resources, and state governments have to play the lead role with the support of the center to significantly increase the strength of our police forces. Then in the DK Basu case of 1996, the Supreme Court had laid down a set of guidelines for preventing custodial torture. Many of these guidelines have already been incorporated into the Criminal Procedure Code, and this actually provides for greater transparency and responsibility with regard to custodial violence. These guidelines have placed a number of restrictions on the police officers and the investigating officers, which deters them from resorting to custodial violence and also provides for accountability in case of such incidents. Then in the Paramveer Singh case of 2003, the Supreme Court has mandated the installation of CCTV cameras in police stations, and the court has even directed the governments to ensure that the maximum area of the police station is covered through CCTV cameras. This is another guideline, another recommendation, which will go a long way in preventing custodial violence, and many police forces are already achieving this. Then, upon that, each incident of custodial violence and death is taken very seriously by the police forces, and there will be not just departmental inquiry and departmental action, but even independent commissions like the NHRC will carry out a thorough investigation to ensure that the guilty officers are held accountable. So, along with these police reforms, what we need is a greater sensitization of our police forces to reiterate the fact that the police is meant to uphold human rights and protect the common public, including their basic fundamental rights and human rights, which is the very bedrock of a democracy. And for such sensitization and awareness, we need police modernization, through which our police forces are modernized and equipped with the right kind of technological tools so that they can be pushed away from relying on inhuman methods of investigation such as torture and violence. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: infrastructure development and eco conservation should go hand in hand. Discuss in the context of proposed infrastructure development in the Himalayan region. The second question: women's security must not be predicated on restrictions of their rights and freedoms. Comment. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers on the portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So, with this, let's conclude the discussion for today. Thanks for watching.